your grand maître, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm thrilled with the what we all learned last night, and I'm looking forward to today, not only because of the subject is interesting, but because Henry is one of those long-term friends. You probably have some in your life that you've known for 20 or 30 years. Well, Henry and I go back 60 years together. We met when we were 14 at Phillips Exeter Academy. And we formed that kind of friendship that only comes through the special cauldron of surviving winters in southern New Hampshire and athletics every day. So this is a level of compatibility and trust and love, really, over the years. Henry Sayre.
When Eric called and suggested I might do this, I said, well, what are you going to pay me? He said, a lot of good wine. And that sold me immediately. This has been really a fun talk to work on. I have written a book on the humanities from cave painting to the present, but it's actually 2 volumes. But it's, to write that, I had to go back and read Plato again and read Socrates and do a lot of things that I hadn't done in 30 or 40 years. Revive my Greek. That was something, yeah. Well, I got Greek at Exeter. But it was, this was a lot like that. This was an exercise in the same sort of thing. So, and we end with Mouton, just to warn you. Okay. I want to begin with a painting all of you probably are familiar with, Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper in the refectory or the dining room of the monastery of Santa Maria della Grazie in Milan. This is, of course, the painting as people in my generation came to know it. It was and it remains in very bad shape due to the fact that instead of using the established fresco technique of painting tempera on wet plaster, Leonardo experimented and applied tempera to dry plaster. And by 1517, the paint had begun to flake off. This is the painting after its 21-year restoration, completed in 1999. A lot of critics were not fond of this, but it made visible what was almost invisible before the restoration: wine. Here, before the restoration, to Jesus' left, 4 glasses and barely visible a pichet. This is the post-restoration tabletop. Still not really visible. But even more detail can be seen in a 2020 Google Art and Culture gigapixel scan of an oil painting on canvas of the original by 2 of Leonardo's students, Pietrino and Giovanni Antonio Boltrafio, executed at the same sizes of the original and probably based on the full-scale drawing of the original, or the cartoon as we know it, which would be transferred to the wall. And even as Leonardo's fresco was beginning to flake off. So they clearly understood that the thing was in trouble and they wanted to save it for posterity. Here, the wine is distinctly visible, and the pichet is empty, which I hope you can see it right there. But extraordinarily rendered in its transparency, as are the glasses of wine. At the left, 3 more glasses, another pichet, and a single glass before Judas Iscariot. There are 3 more glasses, one nearly empty at the very far right, if you see it, and another pichet at the right-hand end of the table. Leonardo represents the moment that Jesus announces to the apostles, "One of you will betray me." And their astonishment is manifest. But a moment later, as narrated in Matthew 26:29, while they were eating, Jesus took bread, said the blessing, broke it, and giving it to his disciples, said, "Take and eat. This is my body." Then he took a cup, gave thanks, and gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. For this is my blood of the covenant, which will be shed on behalf of many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, from now on, I shall not drink this fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it with you new in the kingdom of my Father." Now, this is the moment when Jesus enacts what will become the Eucharist, obviously, announcing the transubstantiation of the everyday world, bread and the fruit of the vine, into the real presence of the divine. Now, in this connection with wine, it is this connection with wine that tells half the story of wine and art, this connection with divinity. The other is, I think, embodied in Jesus' announcement that he will, from now on, abstain from drinking wine until he meets the apostles in heaven. The implication is that in the world, consumption of wine is at least problematic. At least from his point of view, not in keeping with what he understood would be the serious trials of the coming days. An issue addressed some 75 years later in a work painted by Paolo Veronese in the refectory of the Dominican Friary of the Basilica di Santi Giovanni e Paolo in Venice. Another Last Supper, but one that he renamed Feast in the House of Levi after the Roman Catholic Inquisition deemed it heretical, even blasphemous. The inquisitor objected to, first, the fact that if it were not for Christ's halo, one might take the scene for an entirely pagan affair. Certainly the cat and dog below the table contributed to this. So too the servant in yellow, holding an empty wine glass above Peter's head as Peter carves a leg of lamb. Then he wondered how Veronese could justify the man with a bloody nose on the stairs at the left. And Veronese replied that he was a servant that had suffered some sort of accident. Then the inquisitor wondered what possible purpose was served by including a buffoon with a parrot on his wrist. Veronese rather feebly replied he was included for ornament. Note also the apostle seen through the pillars above the buffoon, indecorously picking his teeth with a fork. But the most objectionable were the two soldiers in German dress eating and drinking wine at the far right. Germans from the land of Luther's Reformation at the Last Supper? Sacrilege. As if Germans could partake of the Holy Communion. Does it seem fitting in the Last Supper of the Lord, the inquisitor asked, to paint buffoons, drunkards, Germans, dwarfs, and other vulgarities? Veronese was ordered to improve and correct the painting in 3 months' time. Instead, he changed its title to The Feast in the House of Levi from Luke 27:32, where the tax collector Levi throws a banquet for Jesus. The Pharisees ask Jesus, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" And he replies, "I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." The Inquisition was satisfied. Veronese's painting with the drunken Germans drinking wine was about sinners. At the same time that Veronese was at work on the Last Supper, Seconde Nomine, the Feast in the House of Levi, the Sicilian sculptor Jacopo del Duca was at work on a bronze copy of a Roman marble that was itself a copy of a bronze originally done in the 3rd century BCE by arguably the greatest of Athenian sculptors of all time, Lysippus. Discovered in a Roman garden in 1566, it depicts Silenus, a demigod, holding the infant Dionysius, known as Bacchus to the Romans. but also referred to by the Greeks as Bacchus in one of his epitaphs, meaning frenzied. And after Zeus had impregnated the mortal Semele, the ever-jealous Hera convinced the young maiden that she should ask to see Zeus in all his glory, so that she would be convinced of his immortality. But she was incinerated in the lightning bolts of his full manifestation. Zeus then rescued the fetus of Dionysus from her womb, brought him to full gestation by placing him in a special hollow in his thigh. And then Zeus gave the newborn to Silenus when he was finally mature. Gave the newborn to Silenus, a lover of wine, a demigod himself, accomplished at music and song, and whose own immortality weighed on him so heavily that it was wine and music and song that were his salvation. Silenus raised him. Many believed that Silenus was also gifted with extraordinary wisdom and the power of divination. I have a good deal more to say about Silenus, but suffice it to say now that Ferdinando de' Medici, serving in Rome as a cardinal, obtained permission from the owner of the marble to make a cast of it and hired Del Duca to make a copy. This is the copy. He probably intended it as a gift to his father, thinking that it resembled father and son. To his father Cosimo, the Grand Duke of Tuscany. Del Duca took some liberties with the original. Note, for instance, that the tree trunk on which Silenus is leaning is enriched by a vine creeping up its length, topped by bunches of grapes, leaves, and tendrils. And Silenus's features seem more animated, as if he is laughing with the child, and the grapes in his hair are more well-defined as grapes, not to be mistaken for hair. The Romans were, of course, well acquainted with Bacchus, not least of all through Ovid's recapitulation in Book 3 of the Metamorphoses of the story of Bacchus's birth in Euripides' great play, which I've just told you, the Bacchae. This is a red figure amphora painted in Athens nearly 100 years before Euripides' play by the Cleophaedrus painter, showing the bearded Dionysus celebrating with his followers, a wine cup in one hand and grape leaves in the other. The woman on the right carries a thyrsus, a giant fennel staff topped by a pine cone or artichoke, clearly phallic in its representation, and grapevines in the other. In the play, the blind prophet Tiresias admonishes Pentheus, the young king of Thebes, who does not believe that Dionysus is really a god. This god whom you mock will achieve a greatness I cannot describe throughout Greece. Men enjoy two great blessings, young man. Finally, the goddess Demeter. Firstly, the goddess Demeter, the earth, call her whichever name you will, who sustains mankind by means of dry foods. So there's the bread, right? Then there is he who came afterwards, Semele's son, who invented the liquid draught of the grape to match her gift and introduced it to mortals. This is that puts an end to the sours of wretched men when they get their fill of the flowing vine. This that confers sleep on them and forgetfulness of daily troubles. The chorus agrees. These are his gifts, they intone, to make men dance together as one, to rejoice in the sound of the flute, and to put an end to care when the liquid gleam of the grape enters the ivy-wreathed feasts of men, and the wine bowl casts its veil of sleep over them. The chorus continues. Oh, that I might come to Cyprus, Aphrodite's home. Oh, take me there, Bromius, another name for Dionysus, meaning roaring one. Oh, take me there, Bromius, God who leads your Bacchante's spirit of joy. There are the graces, there is desire, there your worshippers have leave to celebrate your name. Now, it is important to remember that in Euripides, Bacchus Dionysius is a vengeful, even cruel god. He punishes Thebes for its king Pentheus' refusal to accept him as a god by having his female followers, the Maenads, whom Pentheus thinks are indulging in merely carnal desires, tear him limb from limb. This is a Roman fresco of the scene from the Casa de' Vetii in Pompeii, reopened last year after 20 years of restoration, and assuring that his own mother, Agave, tore off his head, impaled it on a pole, and carried it back to Thebes, triumphant, until Pentheus' father, Cadmus, founder of Thebes, showed her how, in her Bacchic frenzy, she had beheaded her own son. This is the house's original owners. This house's original owners, Aulus Vettius Restitutus and Aulus Vettius Conviva, became rich by selling wine after being freed from slavery. Theories in the past have suggested that the two men were brothers, but it is more likely that they met when enslaved and had the same master, Aulus Vettius. And they chose, and so in their home, in their dining room, to be precise, they chose to picture the king of Thebes who dared deny Bacchus about to be torn to bits. For the Vettii, wine was good. To deny that goodness was to risk the terrible wrath of wine's god. More than 2,000 years later, Friedrich Nietzsche recognized in Greek tragedy the revelation of the full nature of the cosmos, both its terror and its joy, the inseparable suffering and ecstasy of human existence. I'm not going to get into Nietzsche's quarrel with Euripides. He blames Euripides for ruining tragedy because he's too naturalistic. But I find it hard to think of Euripides as naturalistic when Pentheus wants to go see the Maenads. He lifts him to the top of a tree, and we go from there. But suffice it to say that the Bacchae is a critical dialectic on the nature of religious ecstasy, dramatizing both the horrors and attractions of Dionysian experience. What balances the Dionysian, of course, the Apollonian in Nietzsche, the formal qualities of art, embodied particularly in the poetry of the chorus. This tradition of simultaneity of horror and attraction in Dionysian experience had been firmly established in Florence ever since the humanist court of Lorenzo de' Medici. A century before Ferdinando de' Medici commissioned this sculpture. The Neoplatonic philosophers Marsilio Ficino and Angelo Poliziano both saw in Bacchus what Ficino called a pure joy, a frenzy, Ficino's word is furore, that can reveal transcendent mysteries. It was in this atmosphere that Michelangelo was raised, essentially under Lorenzo's tutelage. Lorenzo himself, a poet of considerable skills, had written a song, probably accompanied by dance, in the frequent festivals he sponsored. He was a very serious man, but he almost weekly would have a crazy festival. The poem he wrote for that is The Triumph of Bacchus and Ariadne, which rehearses the Ovidian story of Bacchus discovering Ariadne on the island of Naxos, she having been abandoned recently by Theseus, and she, of course, is the half-sister of the Minotaur. Here are Bacchus, Ariadne, for one another all afire. Because time flies and places false, they dance, they always yield to their desire. These nymphs of theirs and other folk are merry every day. Let all who want to now be gay. About tomorrow, no one's sure. This is a painting done some 30 years later for the Duke of Ferrara by the Venetian painter Titian. Bacchus falls in love at first sight and leaps from his chariot towards Ariadne. Some people speculate to protect her from the two cheetahs that pull the chariot. For the Duke of Ferrara owned cheetahs. Titian's painting seems less imbued with love, all afire, than Lorenzo's poem. Rather, Ariadne is caught in a moment between deep loss, her abandonment by Theseus, whose departing boat can be seen just beyond her left shoulder, and the joyfulness of Bacchus's arrival. She is immersed, that is, in the inseparable suffering and ecstasy of human experience. But Bacchus asked her to marry him, and as a wedding gift offered her the sky, where she was forever immortalized, when upon her death he threw her crown into the sky, where it became the corona borealis seen at the upper left. As we will see, this marriage would be one of the most popular subjects in 16th and 17th century European painting. But to return to 15th century Florence, 6 years after the composition of Lorenzo's poem, in 1496, after he had moved to Rome following Lorenzo's death in 1492, Michelangelo carved out of a single block one of his very first sculptures, a Bacchus and Faun. Bacchus is depicted staggering out of balance. He holds a cup of wine in his right hand, at which he seems to gaze in a drunken stare. Ascanio Condivi, Michelangelo's contemporary biographer, described the eyes of Bacchus as savage and lascivious, belonging to a man too much possessed by the love of wine. Many of you have that same look on your face last night. The piece was purchased in Rome by Francisco de' Medici in 1572, a year after Francesco's younger brother, Ferdinando, commissioned Del Duca to copy the Silenus and Infant Bacchus, and moved it to Florence. Thus, two Bacchuses graced the Medici gardens in their home city, one an infant in the arms of Silenus, the other a tottering youth. It is not too far-fetched to suggest that in the 16th and 17th century Italy, almost every credible family estate, that is, the estates of those who valued art and supported it, boasted a Bacchus, or two, or three. Early in the 16th century, as we have seen, the Duke of Ferrara, Alfonso d'Este, commissioned Titian to paint his Bacchus and Ariadne, and another here. And there are two other bacchanals in the same room, the Duke's so-called alabaster chamber. One, the Feast of the Gods, painted by Giovanni Bellini in 1514 and later redone by Titian, features a scene from Ovid in which Priapus, god of fertility, and on the right there, Priapus, god of fertility, is seen at the right lifting the skirts of the beautiful nymph Lotus when wine has lulled her to sleep. His attempt is foiled, however, by the donkey of Silenus on the left, whose raucous brain awakens Lotus, and she pushes Priapus away, to the amusement of everyone. Below, Silenus and his donkey is the young Bacchus decanting wine into a pitcher. The other painting by Titian in Ferrara's chamber was the Bacchanal of the Andrians, depicting the inhabitants of the island of Andros, so loved by Bacchus that he gave the people a stream flowing with not water, but wine. Silenus lies in the drunken stupor in the background, perhaps representing the source of the river. And in the foreground, a toddler urinates beside a sheet of music, the lyrics of which read, He who drinks and doesn't drink again doesn't know what drinking is. Everyone is drinking in the scene, and the air of sexual license is manifest. Note at the top left also that the grapes even grow up the tree. In Rome, toward the end of the century, Alessandro Farnese, grandson of Pope Paul III, commissioned Annibale Carracci to paint a fresco cycle to decorate the ceiling of the main gallery of the Piano Nobile of the family palace. Called the Loves of the Gods, the central panel is the triumph of Bacchus and Ariadne. The loving couple enter on two separate chariots from the left, his drawn by tigers, hers by goats. A corpulent Silenus appears ready to fall off his donkey on the right. Baccanti play tambourines and horns. Cupid crowns Ariadne with a constellation of stars that will become the Corona Borealis. And just as Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel marks the beginning of the 16th century with a monumental Roman ceiling painting, the Galleria Farnese closes the century with a similarly magnificent ceiling decoration. Sacred, the former, secular, the latter. These frescoes were tremendously influential, for 2 centuries ranking with Michelangelo's work in the Sistine Chapel and Raphael's frescoes in the Vatican as the supreme examples of Western painting. Generations of young painters were sent, literally well into the 19th century, were sent to copy this. Simultaneous with Carracci's commission for the Farnese Palace, the Cardinal Francesco del Monte invited a young painter from Lombardy, Michelangelo Merisi, known as Caravaggio, to live and work at the palace, the Palazzo Madama. The 2 palaces were an 8-minute walk apart, and the 2 painters were rivals. At least the very hot-headed Caravaggio considered Carracci his rival. When Carracci won the commission in 1601 to paint the altarpiece for the Serassi Chapel at Santa Maria del Popolo, Caravaggio also received a commission to paint the side panels. It seems hardly accidental that the rump of St. Paul's cart horse is turned toward Carracci's painting. Furthermore, among the earliest works of Caravaggio that Caravaggio painted for the Cardinal del Monte is a Bacchus, painted the same year as Carracci began work on the triumph of Bacchus and Ariadne. The painting depicts a semi-nude, attractively muscular young man undoing the belt of his robe. This is not the mythic Bacchus, but a boy dressed up as Bacchus, probably pulled off the street by Caravaggio to pose, as the dirt beneath his fingernails attests. It is a painting about the pleasures of indulging in the sensual appetites, and it suggests, as do the recumbent nudes in the other paintings we have seen, the pleasures of carnal desire and their connection to wine. It seems likely that Peter Paul Rubens saw Carracci's triumph of Bacchus and Ariadne, and very likely the Caravaggio's, when he was in Italy, first in Mantua and then in Rome, from 1600 to 1608. Rubens from Antwerp was an extraordinarily accomplished humanist who read all the classics, both Greek and Roman, in their originals. Later in life, he would himself paint Bacchus and Ariadne, part of an enormous commission from King Philip IV of Spain to decorate his hunting lodge, a commission Rubens could only undertake because he employed so many artists in his studio. Here, Ariadne seems wary of Bacchus's advances. But this is only a sketch, one of 60 Rubens did for the project, and the final painting was done by his student Erasmus Quilinus. Here, Ariadne is much less distressed. Rubens was deeply interested in classical sculpture, and in Silenus particularly, who represented to him the frankly sensual side of human experience. In Rome, Rubens saw a Roman sculpture of Silenus with a wineskin and drew it. Soon after, beginning sometime around 1610, he began work on a large painting, nearly 7 by 7 feet, the Drunken Silenus, which he hung in his Antwerp home for the rest of his life. There was as well a bust of Silenus in the garden. Now first, it is notable that Silenus is about to trip over a mother satyr suckling her twins, one at each breast, and she in fact fondles the genitals of one of them. Furthermore, behind Silenus is a young woman who bears a remarkable resemblance to his first wife, Isabel Brandt, whom he married in 1609 and who died of the plague in 1626. Silenus in Rubens's eyes is closely identified with the life force, and it's worth saying female, the creative energy of the universe. Rubens wants to identify with that energy and that force. It was Virgil who made Silenus a central figure in the making of art. In the 6th eclogue, 2 shepherds and a nymph named Aegle come upon Silenus drinking and asleep, drunk and asleep. They tie him up with wreaths. Aegle smears his forehead with mulberry juice and then wakes him up and makes him sing. He pours out a poetry of creation, of the world that began in a vast void, and how the seeds of the earth, soul, sea, and fire were gathered together, how the human race was created by throwing stones after the great flood, of the gods and their loves, and he sang until nightfall. Rubens scholars have shown that Rubens was undoubtedly reading Ovid's 6th eclogue when this drawing was made. And Svetlana Alpers, arguably our greatest scholar of 17th century Dutch painting, has shown that Rubens' identification with Silenus, whom he drew and painted literally dozens of times, evokes his desire, she says, for access to a potent, ecstatic form of creating. In this, Rubens anticipates Nietzsche, who in The Will to Power writes, "My instinct wanted a justification of life, even in its most frightful, ambiguous, and mendacious. I had in hand for this the formula Dionysian." In 1630, Rubens returned to Antwerp after almost 1.5 years in continuous diplomatic travels between Spain and England, hoping that in achieving a peace between the two superpowers, a truce might be effected between the United Provinces of the North, essentially Holland, and his native Spanish Netherlands, Belgium. In Spain, he spent a lot of time with the young painter Diego Velázquez, who was establishing himself in the court of Philip IV. Both were studying and Rubens copying Philip's collection of Titians, including the Bacchanal of the Adrians. And they must have talked a lot about the painting that Velázquez was at work on in these months, the Triumph of Bacchus, which became known in the 19th century as Los Borrachos, the drunkards. This latter nickname has led to a pretty significant misunderstanding of Velázquez's work here. In the 17th century, Spaniards believed that originally Bacchus had conquered Iberia, introducing the grape and hence wine to the peninsula. Velázquez is depicting the former ruler of Spain in his traditional role as the benefactor whose gift of wine brought his subjects relief from the burdens of everyday life. The painting is an exemplary model of royal comportment, and it is no accident that Philip hung it in his bedroom. It was, of course, these characters at the right that give the painting the name Los Borrachos, as if Bacchus were not in the painting. It is my guess that that it was this crowd that most interested Rubens. Their presence in a triumph of Bacchus as evidently drunken common people enjoying themselves. For the most ambitious painting that Rubens took up after his return to Antwerp in 1830 was the Kermesse. A giant painting, incidentally. There are no royalty here. Rural Flemish peasants pour out of a tavern at a diagonal into the panoramic space of the countryside. Rising above the twirling, swirling interlace of arms and legs, beside the tree at the center is the band. The most prominent couple spin in a passionate embrace, the man's hat falling to the ground before them. At the right edge, a young man and a disheveled woman, her blouse falling from her shoulders, run off across the bridge, presumably to indulge their appetites beside some hedge. And the painting is totally ambiguous because it can be interpreted on the one hand as a joyous celebration of sensual pleasure, but on the other as a descent into animal debauchery. Directly below the dancing couple, a dog drops his nose into a cloth-draped tub, and above them, an apparently frightened man drags off his wife as if someone is trying to steal his beer. The nursing babies throughout, themselves a product of sexual indulgence, do not so much imply abundance as animal hunger, the desire to be fulfilled. And the two men at the opposite sides of the table appear to be quarreling, and the old woman pours beer down a child's throat. But the energy and ambition of Rubens' 8-foot-wide canvas suggests he is somehow equally moved by the unbridled license, both good and bad, that he portrays. Painted in much the same spirit 30 years later is Jan Steen's Dancing Couple, but there is a crucial difference. Rubens' merrymakers are drinking beer. Steen's are drinking wine. The gentleman depicted to the lady's left, touching gently her chin, is incidentally a self-portrait. In the early decades of the 17th century, per capita consumption of beer in the Dutch Republic has been estimated at 250 to 300 liters, or 66 to 79 gallons per year. And small beer, which had very low alcohol content, was considered suitable for children. Municipal revenues from excise taxes of alcohol confirm beer's dominance. For example, in the fiscal year 1644 to 45, Rotterdam's consumption of tax on beer furnished a whopping 91.5% of the city's alcohol impost receipts, whereas wine provided just 7%, and brandy's share amounted to a mere 1.5%. But as Henriette de Bruyn-Kroops has outlined in her book, A Spirited Exchange, the wine and brandy trade between France and the Dutch Republic in its Atlantic framework, 1600 to 1650. Over the course of the 17th century, as the Dutch East India Company rose to dominance, the booming economy ensured that wines imported from France, the Iberian Peninsula, the Mediterranean, and the Southern Rhine came within the financial reach of an increasingly large segment of the population. All alcohol was subject to consumption tax, and municipalities employed wynroers, sworn wine gaugers, for proper assessments. Applying sophisticated mathematical skills, these specialists could calculate a barrel's exact content after measuring the liquid's level with a marked rod stuck through the bunghole. In fact, almost all the wine was stored in barrels, and as this painting of wine connoisseurs suggests, tax was paid on as this painting suggests. Tax was paid on quality and quantity, and the resulting impost voucher became akin to a barrel's passport, rather like an e-provenance certification, by which it could be cellared, sold, and transported. One of the most successful wine gaugers was, in fact, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, the lens maker who reported the discovery of little animals, actually bacteria and protozoa, to the Royal Society of London in 1678. Steen was obsessed with painting the consumption of wine. He painted the story of the marriage feast at Cana, in which Christ transformed 6 stone jars filled with water into the finest wines. He painted it 6 times, which means the subject was in demand in 17th century Amsterdam. Christ here stands in front of the second column on the left. Here he is beneath the orchestra at the right. In all of them, Christ's miracle is underplayed, relegated to the periphery in each, and the consumption of wine and the celebration of the marriage take center stage, as if to authorize the conspicuous consumption of the Dutch themselves. Port records for Amsterdam reveal that in the fiscal year 1667 to 1668, the good people of Amsterdam consumed 20,622.5 tons of imported French wine. Applying the population estimate of 220,000 in the 1880s, per capita consumption of French wines alone would have been about 85.6 liters or 22.6 gallons per year, or almost a full cup per day for every man, woman, and child. But these numbers do not include Italian and Spanish wines, smuggled wines, of which there were large quantities, or wines imported from overland, from Flanders, for instance, nor could all families obviously afford to drink wine. Those who did spend money on wine clearly drank far more than a cup per day, like this happy family. Technically, this picture is a critique of Dutch life, the dissolution of one generation passed on to the next. The grandmother, seated behind the dog, sings to the accompaniment of the piper on her right. The score she holds in her hand reads, "As it is sung, so it is piped. That's long been known. I'll sing first and you follow along from 1 to 100 years later." Across the table, a laughing old man wears a hat traditionally donned by new fathers at baptisms. So he is the father of the child in the mother's lap. The woman raising her glass to be filled is usually assumed to be Steen's wife, and Steen himself, in another self-portrait, stands behind the grandmother, teaching his son to smoke. But surely this is no critique. It's a self-mocking, rather rowdy celebration of what it pretends to critique. French painting is void of such scenes, perhaps because Paris was the largest market for work of this type, and there was little need to reiterate its gestures. And the French knew Dutch painting well. Cardinal Richelieu, who served both Louis XIV and Louis XV, owned a large number of Rubenses, including the Drunken Silenus, incidentally, that we saw earlier. Louis XIV purchased the Kermesse in 1685, and the great Rococo painter Jean-Antoine Watteau copied it at least 6 times, including this marvelous red chalk realization of Rubens's central dancing couple. A couple that would find its way into Watteau's painting of 1718-19, The Surprise. The presence of Dutch painting is manifest in the 5-foot-high, 10-foot-long signboard he painted for Parisian art dealer Edmé François Gersaint in 1721. Buyers peruse the gallery's many works, including a man who peers through a magnifying glass at the nudes in a forest scene. And above this group at the right, a canvas appears to depict a drunken Silenus. I think you can see him right up there. And beside this painting is a reclining nude. French 18th century painting is renowned for its depictions of intimate and erotic gatherings of men and women. In Watteau's many Fêtes Galantes, in Fragonard's Tris, like that depicted in the famous Swing. But save for a couple of still lifes by Chardin, there is surprisingly little wine in their work. It is almost as if one is just to assume it's there, or was there just a little while ago. In fact, I could find only one Watteau, and I went through books, perhaps his most copied work, incidentally, where wine is present, The Pleasures of the Ball, from 1715 to 17. This painting is only about 2 foot square. And so the detail I'm about to show you is only about 5 inches high. But the woman dressed in black, perhaps maroon, who may be the hostess, is taking a glass of wine from her servant. And behind her, another servant stands at a serving table with 2 carafes of wine, some glasses, and a silver pitcher. This is about all the wine I could find in 18th century French painting. In fact, it remains curiously absent in French painting until the time of the Impressionists. There is, however, a lot of writing about wine, especially the proclivity of revolutionaries and the working class, who were, after all, revolutionaries, to fortify themselves with its liberation-inducing properties, to say nothing of its ability to sedate them from the trials of their everyday lives. The dedication of the Impressionists to everyday life has something to do with their willingness to represent wine and wine drinking in an almost casual way. In Renoir's Luncheon of the Boating Party, for instance, with its tabletop covered with bottles of wine, empty glasses, and behind the left side of the left-hand bottle, a small wooden cask, probably a cognac keg. Or Monet's Luncheon in the Grass. An intentionally gentrified revision of Edouard Manet's Luncheon on the Grass, which had caused such a fuss at the Salon des Refusés in 1863, with its scandalous and offensively casual public nudity. But no wine, at least not apparently. This may be an empty wine bottle of a square shape beside the leftovers of the picnic. But the bottle is more likely, in fact, a liquor flask of some sort. Nevertheless, it is as if Monet saw the bottles of wine in his painting, along with the tablecloth, wine glasses, plates, and napkins, as part and parcel of some civilizing force. The tension that we felt between drunkenness and enjoyment, between Bacchic celebration and excess, Dionysian revelry and violence, is simply absent in Impressionist art, except perhaps in one of Manet's greatest works, Chez le Père Latouille, painted in 1879. The cafe was just up the street across the Place de Clichy from Manet's home. It was named after the family patriarch who, just before the Battle of Paris in 1814, had declared to the soldiers defending Paris, "Drink, my friends, drink for free. Don't leave a single bottle of my wine in the casks." It is 65 years later. The restaurant is still in the family. Manet has recruited the owner's son to pose as the young man, something of a gigolo, trying to seduce an older, very proper young woman. She holds a fruit knife in her hand to carve the piece of fruit before her. No place is set for him. He has simply kneeled beside her and has served the glass of champagne that accompanies her dessert. One can see the bottle on ice at the left edge of the painting, and the champagne was often served in such glassware in the 19th century. The waiter observes the scene with some concern. Perhaps he would simply like to serve her coffee, or perhaps he disapproves. It seems likely that Manet was bringing into contemporary terms the many seduction scenes rehearsed in 17th century Dutch painting, such as this one by Gabriel Metsu, he had traveled to Amsterdam in 1872 after the Franco-Prussian War to see Dutch painting, and he knew it well. In Metsu's painting, the wine serves as something of a catalyst for bad behavior. In Manet's, it acts as a kind of fulcrum between propriety and seduction. But it was in the hands of the next generation of painters, particularly Vincent van Gogh, that the full ambiguity of the grape was restored. In Arles in 1888, Van Gogh painted a night cafe, an establishment in the Place Lamartine that was able to stay open all night on account of the introduction of gas lighting. In a letter to his brother Theo, he wrote, "In my picture of the night cafe, I have tried to express the idea that the cafe is a place where one can ruin oneself, run mad, or commit a crime. I have tried to express the terrible passions of humanity by means of red and green. Everywhere there is a clash and contrast of the most alien reds and greens. So I have tried to express, as it were, the powers of darkness in a low wine shop, and all this in an atmosphere like a devil's furnace of pale sulfur. It is color not locally true, but from the point of view of the stereoscopic realist, but color to suggest the emotion of an ardent temperament." A few days later, on October 3rd, he would paint a vineyard just to the north of Arles, near the town of Montmajour, in green. And a month later, on November 3rd, the same vineyard in red. Together, by means of red and green, they express the terrible passions of humanity. The sky and the red vineyard, a harvest taking place in an atmosphere like a devil's furnace of pale sulfur. A month later, he would cut off his ear in a fit of rage. Now, I'm always loath to assign psychological meaning to Van Gogh's brushwork, but the tangle of vines, the laying of paint, the sheer energy of execution suggests something of his psychological state. In late April or early May, just before his brother Theo arranges for him to be admitted to the asylum at Saint-Remy, Vincent writes his sister, "Every day I take the remedy that the incomparable Dickens prescribes against suicide in Nicholas Nickleby. It consists of a glass of wine, a piece of bread and cheese, and a pipe of tobacco." In a little over a year, he would in fact commit suicide, but wine was a palliative for many months. In fact, when he arrived in Auvers-sur-Oise in May 1889 to go under the care of Dr. Paul Gachet, he would paint vineyards again. Soon after he arrived, this drawing and watercolor that he intended, according to a letter to his brother, to transform into a large painting. It is, I think, with the old vines and the old woman, something of an essay on longevity or survival. Then a few weeks later, in early June, he painted vineyards at Auvers. The grapes are probably Sauvignon Blanc, as opposed to Grenache or Mourvedre grapes, given the late date of the harvest in the earlier painting, in the Arles paintings. But the red roofs and poppies bordering the vineyards on the left suggest that the tension we found in Arles has been somewhat alleviated. But the tangle of vines, the gestural exuberance of his handling of paint still suggests what might be called the psychological entanglement of the artist himself. The other thing to say, of course, is that the Auvers paintings date from the spring, from the time of the ancient Athenian Dionysia, when the great tragedies were performed in ancient Greece, a time of renewal. The Arles paintings are of the harvest, the end of things, so far as the vines are concerned, but the beginning of the promise of the wine itself. This is, I think, the real connection between wine and art. That creation begins in the moment of dissolution. This is, in fact, what the character of Silenus represents. Which brings me to Picasso. In March 1917, 2 months before the Ballet Parade, with the sets and costumes by Picasso, opened in Paris, The founder of the Ballet Russe, Serge Diaghilev, the ballet's scenario writer, Jean Cocteau, and the choreographer Leonid Massine, and Picasso visited Pompeii. This is a photograph taken by Cocteau of Picasso and Massine sitting in the garden of Marco Lucrezio, the Grand Duke of Pompeii. Behind them is the water source for the garden's pool, sitting in the aedicula, or sacred niche, a sculpture of Silenus. Under his left arm is a wineskin, which has an opening to serve as the fountain. Here he wears a leopard skin that fails to cover his genitals, and he is clearly drunken. This is an 1870 photograph of the garden with the Silenus in the back niche. The garden was in fact filled with Bacchic sculptures, satyrs, fauns, even Herms with Bacchus's head atop them on each side of Silenus. Inside, on the south wall of the tabulum, the room just off the atrium across from the entrance that opened up on its far side into the garden, was a fresco of Bacchus and Ariadne. Riding in a chariot drawn by 2 oxen, the drunken Bacchus holds his wine cup aloft and Ariadne cares for him. Silenus rides in front on a donkey. Now, it is worth noting that in 1916, when Cocteau first introduced Picasso to Diaghilev, Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy was still all the rage among this group, and among the surrealists particularly. As early as 1901 in Barcelona, appreciations of Nietzsche's book appeared in the Arte Jovin, which Picasso co-founded and co-edited. When he painted the decidedly un-Cubist portrait of Olga Koklova, a dancer with the Ballet Russe with whom he had fallen in love and whom he married in 1918, he was careful to place her on a chair decorated with flowers and foliage, at the top of which is a bunch of ripe grapes. But the style is decidedly Apollonian, classical in its realization, the Dionysian reality of the relationship barely suggested. When in 1921 the couple moved into a villa in Fontainebleau, 6 months after the birth of their first child, Paolo, the first thing he drew was an ink drawing of a grapevine growing on a trellis, complete with a young bunch of grapes at the top. His friend Guillaume Apollinaire, the poet with the Apollonian name, who wrote Dionysian poetry, Apollinaire had sparked his interest in Nietzsche in the early part of the decade, and Diaghilev's dancers, Olga in particular, had sparked his interest again in the second half of the decade. He imagined, as Elizabeth Cowling has put it, disciplined ballerinas, Apollonian in nature, reverting to their atavistic origins, shedding their flimsy dresses, and abandoning themselves to sensual rapture. He proposed such a ballet to Diaghilev. He even did some drawings. Here, 4 ballerinas hurled themselves at a lone male dancer, but Diaghilev rejected the idea. Picasso painted or etched bacchanals over and over again, especially after he met 17-year-old Marie-Therese Walter in 1927 and abandoned Olga. Now, this is not the place to get into Picasso's biography, his notorious womanizing, but life had become for him something of a bacchanal. And that is realized, I think, in this image of Silenus in the company of dancers. Picasso was, after all, more than twice Marie-Therese's age, and aging Silenus next to her youthful beauty. He painted Marie-Therese many more times than Olga, and she inspired the 100 prints that comprised the Vollard suite, mostly completed in 1933 and 1934. In the suite, he appears as Bacchus. The style of the drawing is distinctly classical, the white paper almost announcing itself as marble. But he also thought of himself as the Minotaur, half man, half beast, Ariadne's half-brother, inspired not least of all by André Breton's surrealist publication Minotaur, for which he provided the cover of the inaugural issue. Picasso saw the Minotaur as one of his alter egos, intensely violent and as the manifestation of, as Breton saw him, the deep-rooted anxieties of the unconscious mind. When the Minotaur first presents himself lying beside Marie-Therese in the Volard suite, he is almost Apollonian in his orderly, if overtly sexualized behavior, toasting his mistress with champagne. He appears sharing two women with Picasso's other alter ego, Bacchus, and the two toasting each other, as if to say violence, and remember in Euripides' Bacchae, Dionysius could be as violent and as vengeful as anyone, and the celebration of sexual license, thinking that violence and sexual license can be harmonized. In an edition of 50 prints made soon after the Volard suite, but kept by Picasso unsigned and undistributed until his death, probably because he had already met his next love, Picasso as Bacchus toasts Marie-Therese. Then, in the 1950s, when Fernand Mourlot published his third volume of Picasso lithographs, Picasso returned to the theme of the Bacchanal with a centaur, a faun, a Rubens-like female, and Picasso in his role as Bacchus on the front cover. He was 75 years old. In 1959, the Galerie Louise Larice in Paris issued an edition of 50, a new linocut depicting a bacchanal with an owl. The owl overlooks the scene from the top of what appears to be a wall, way up on the top left. And the owl is an ancient symbol of Antibes, and Picasso had in fact rescued an owl with a broken claw that was discovered in 1946 at the Musée Grimaldi, today the Musée Picasso, in Antibes. In 1957, another owl frequented his studio at La Californie, high above Cannes, and he fed him twice a day. Here, beneath the owl, yet another alter ego, the owl. Next to an acrobat, Silenus appears to be playing cymbals. In an homage to Bacchus, printed in 1960, Bacchus sits on a pediment holding a cup in his raised hand, and below him a maiden drinks from a cup held to her lips by Silenus. The image could be taken, I think, as autobiographical. When Picasso died in 1973, at the age of 91, the Baron Philippe Rothschild honored the painter's memory by choosing a Bacchanal of 1959 in the Chateau's collection to grace the label. The original watercolor in gouache was 13 3/4 by 21 5/8 inches and has been reduced by 5 times. Here it's approximately 2.5 by 4 inches. Since 1945, the Baron had been commissioning artwork for each year, as you probably all know. But 1973 also happened to be the first year that his wine was designated Premier Cru. Philippe thus became the first proprietor to have his 1855 classification successfully amended. When Chateau Mouton Rothschild had second gross status, the motto of its wine was Premier ne puis, second ne daigne, Mouton suis. First, I cannot be. Second, I do not deign to be. Mouton, I am. When it was elevated to first gross status in 1973, the motto became, and you can see it on the label, Premier je suis, second je fus, Mouton ne change. First I am, second I used to be, Mouton does not change. So there is a kind of double celebration here of a life, Picasso's, in all its Bacchic dimensions, and of a wine in all its glory, finally achieving the status it deserved. This is the graffiti painter. I want to go back. No, I guess not. At any rate, Eric, I'm not getting this to work. Just a second. Eric brought 3 labels, of which this is one. This is the graffiti writer Keith Haring's 1988 label. For Mouton to commission Haring is itself daring in its own right, for he was in 1988 perhaps the most visible of the anti-AIDS activists, famous for his images of dancing gay males. He would himself die of AIDS in 1990. The Pop Shop after which this is named, was the outlet where Herring sold affordable images, T-shirts, prints, posters, whatever, at 292 Lafayette Street in Soho. It didn't close until well after his death in September 2005. Here, the dancing goats refer perhaps to the Mouton Museum's famous early 17th century ram cup. This is Francis Bacon's label from 1990. It features a hand holding a glass of wine extending, I think, from a body as if it were looking down directly from above. His painting, as the Mouton Rothschild website says, celebrates naked flesh, virility, the male figure captured in a scathing isolation. But my feeling is that maybe he read the Roald Dahl story we read last night. Because Roald Dahl, as you might remember, somehow it was well worthwhile. It was, let me put my glasses on. Somehow it was all mouth and lips, the full wet lower lip hung in the center, a perverted gross lip, a kind of large I can't even read my own writing, a kind of large, swarthy, sniveling machine. That kind of sums it up, I think. But my only comment is that Bacon was sure that the wine helped. Annette Messenger's label claims to be biblical, according to the Mouton Rothschild website. They are thinking about Psalms 104:15. God made wine to gladden the heart of men, or perhaps the breasts here, Joel 3:18. In that day the mountains shall drip sweet wine, and the hills shall flow with milk. But I think the real meaning of this image is what is most obvious. A toast by a feminist, hallelujah, to female sexuality. But I'm particularly fond of artists whose work I followed closely for many years. This is Zhu Bing's 2018 label. This is 2019 Olafur Eliasson's, and this is the 2020 Peter Doig. In the mid-1990s, Zhu Bing created what he called square word calligraphy, a system which organizes the letters of each English word into structures that resemble Chinese characters. The label actually reads Mouton Rothschild. M-O-U-T-O-N R-O-T-H-S-C-H-I-L-D. This is the first page of a 17-foot scroll that describes the process of converting English into Chinese calligraphy. One consequence of this project is that Chinese speakers can understand how Chinese characters are similarly composed of discrete phonetic and lexicographic components. The Eliasson is one of my all-time favorites. The iris in the middle of this circular oculus shape is actually a hole in the label that reveals the wine inside the bottle. At left is sunrise, at the right, sunset. A series of ellipses surround the iris, tracing the path of the sun at the chateau, the lowest arc in the top half, daylight, which corresponds to the lowest arc in the bottom, night, in the shortest day of the year. The topmost curve represents the longest day of the year and corresponds to the highest white line below, representing the shortest night of the year. The figure eight shapes are known as analemmas. This is an analemma plotting the path of the sun in the sky as seen at noon Greenwich Meridian time from the Royal Observatory. Eliasson's analemmas track the path of the sun at every hour of the day at the vineyard throughout the year. Much further south than the Royal Observatory, the bottom of the figure eight is thus much elongated. Eliason is renowned for his ability to encapsulate climate and natural history in profound, often beautiful but unsettling ways. In 2003, in the enormous 500-foot space of the Turbine Hall at the Tate Gallery in London, he created an environment in which a giant yellow orb hung 90 feet above the floor. The ceiling was itself covered with mirrors, thus doubling the size of the space. The sun, which was actually a semicircle of some 200 yellow sodium streetlights, which when reflected in the ceiling mirrors and formed a circle. Artificial mist machines filled the hall with a dull, wintry fog. And 2 million visitors saw the work in its run from October 16, 2003 to March 21, 2004. And most visitors felt that they were immersing themselves in the future. Doig's piece is, I think, magical. It is quite consciously a reference to Van Gogh's vineyard painting, replacing the golden orb of the sun in the red vineyard with a full moon and all the coloring of the green vineyard in the painting itself. As Doig writes in the Mouton Rothschild Labels website, it's a sort of ode to workers, to all those involved at the various stages of making a wine before it's fully bottled. It's a dream with a romantic streak, as if someone spontaneously decided to sing in the vines. It's a moment of poetry where you can take your time. It's neither really day or really night, but rather something in between waking and sleeping. It's possible to see it as a progression, a dream journey in the world of the harvest. This is honestly almost what all of Doig's paintings do. This is nearly 25 years old, the White Canoe. The white canoe in the center, seemingly gliding on the water in which it is reflected, mirror-like, carries the imagination of the viewer into a dreamlike space. It is the equivalent of the moon in the Mouton Cadet label, the curve of which is mirrored by the guitar player's hat. He plays a song, a moment of poetry, as old and timeless as the pipers of Bacchus or the poetry of Silenus. That's what making wine is. A song about the dream of the harvest, a journey to the final bottle, like a painting that begins with a dream of what it might become, a journey of brushwork and subtle consequential moves, a compromise or affinity with the accidental facts of the weather that you somehow have to balance out, like Eliason's weather, that ideally results in a perfect or near perfect bottle. That's what drinking wine is about as well, I think. A nose, a swirl in the mouth, a feel on the palate, the taste of fruit and terroir, an invitation to the next sense-affirming mouthful, the dream of a perfect or near-perfect bottle. As Nietzsche realized, as Silenus knew well, it is the promise of art, of poetry, finally of wine, that makes life bearable. Thank you. Comments, questions, whatever. We have a mic. If you're going to ask a question, we'd like to. Right back here.
Okay. Sorry. Well, I want to thank you for all the hard work and insights. It was really a great comprehensive retrospective and very insightful. I was just focusing on your very first images, Last Supper, because during this last Passover season, I was researching some history, and there was some writing that said that it's possible that the Last Supper was a Passover Seder. Interestingly enough.
That's interesting. Yeah.
But I noticed that the color of the wine might have been an artistic license to show the talent of the artist with transparency, but I also recall that wine over history was usually heavily diluted, claret being somewhat clear.
And you know, not bottled and very young.
Correct.
So
and rather unripe, not with the extract
exactly.
and the color we get today.
It was the Romans who first put sulfur. So there were preservatives at Christ's time in wine, but I mean, the wine they're drinking is Lebanese. So who knows? Right.
Maybe maybe the wafers that people use for communion are effectively pieces of matzah.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah.
So I'm very new to the whole organization, but I would just say it was a beautiful presentation. Appreciate that. I'm a former history teacher, so a lot of the things you're sharing with us, strike a chord. Being raised Roman Catholic and serving in the Catholic Church for quite some time, lots of different roles as an educator. It's really interesting to hear your perspective on how you view it. We spent some time in Rome, and so some of the frescoes and some of the work, and how you particularly picked a couple pieces around this topic area is very interesting to me, because obviously they're surrounded by a mass of other content, but you did a beautiful job of presenting that. I'm curious, you jumped us all the way to a wine label at the end. Okay, I was kind of curious, like what your kind of inspiration was to get us to there at the end of your...
Actually, it was the labels. Eric and I were talking about it. It was the labels that inspired the talk. So how do you get to those labels was really the question. Yeah. And I should tell you, when we were at Exeter, we had to go to church every Sunday, and I was raised a Methodist, but I was a Latin scholar, and in those days, the service was still all Latin. So I started going to the Catholic Church, and I started irreverently taking communion and doing whatever. So I was a Catholic for a year, and then they changed the Mass to English, and I quit going and went back to went back. But so the Vatican ruined my Latin. But my parents were Episcopal, so they did communion too, and I never got around to saying it, but I'm particularly struck by the connection between the divine and the everyday that the Eucharist clearly embodies, but also in mythology, the connection between the immortality of Dionysius and Silenus and their passion for, and I think this is really true, their passion for everyday people. And I think, there's a church, I tried to figure out a way to put this in the paper, but I couldn't do it. Santa Costanza in Rimini has a mosaic ceiling all the way around the apse, it's a circular church, of the harvest. So it's grapes, sort of wildly entangled grapes, and men harvesting the grapes and stomping the grapes and everything. And it seems to me that probably the early church understood that connection much more than Picasso, for instance. Yeah. But Picasso was Catholic. Sort of.
Ish.
Yeah, Catholic-ish, that's right. Yeah.
I wanted to share, is this on? Or?
Yeah, it's on.
That Eric has graciously shared 3 of those bottles with those labels, the Mouton 88, the 90, and the 17, which we'll have at lunch.
Yeah. Those first 3 that I did, the first 3, yeah.
Somebody brought a beautiful 2014 last night.
Oh, it was great. That was the Hockney. And that was really terrific, yeah.
Henry, you've outdone yourself. And I'm particularly delighted that we captured this on videotape.
Yeah.
Because I think the whole speech by itself is something that I can easily watch again and get more out of. But I also recognize that there are segments that will go on our Commandery playlist
Oh,
along with other vintners and stories. I'm most curious now that you've put this together, what you learned in the process.
This is actually, I've always known that the creative process begins in a kind of despair, a kind of blank, like painters begin with a blank canvas. And I've always loved the fact, I love Cy Twombly as a painter. And he actually has a bunch of wine paintings that I almost tried to figure out how to get into this, but it's getting too long. But but Twombly writes about the fact that what he liked about painting was that he would have to make a mark. And that mark would change the entire blank slate. And then he would make another mark, and that would change everything again. And he never quite knew where he was going. He knew when he was done. But that it was a process that began in nothingness, or we could say dissolution, and moved toward final creation. And I think working on this paper really reaffirmed that for me. And working on Salinas himself, who's quite a character. Yeah.
I very deliberately wrote down the sentence, creation begins in the moment of dissolution. Mm-hmm. But I think I see a component of it that may be a little different from the despair you talk about, because I hear in that the immortality, that the very nature of wine every year, what is at the beginning going to the ground and starting again, and year after year having these wonderful wines as a part of that whole story.
As that cycle. And I think that's what Van Gogh's painting. And what is remarkable to me about that is the way, when you go to vineyards, when you visit vineyards, they always speak of the vine as dead. Over and over again. It's just this dead thing all winter long. And then it is reborn. And they use that language all the time. I mean, we were just at Nicholas J. about a year ago. And that's exactly the language he used. And so there is instilled really in I think all winemaking, this sense of renewal. And what's really interesting to me, actually, and I hadn't thought about this till I did the paper, that at the moment of the harvest, which is the end of the vine, you get the beginning of the wine. So there's a kind of double, there's a kind of figure eight.
So I would like to come back to Vincent van Gogh's last days. And as you mentioned, his last days were marked by the consumption of wine and cheese. Do we know which wine he was drinking, and do we know which cheese he was drinking? That's a very good segue for tomorrow.
They know which wine, and I bought the wine to see. It's the vineyard is still there, and it's owned by, and it's Mourvedre. Yeah, and it's owned by Chateau Hauvette, Hauvette, which is, and I bought the wine. The Caroline is absolutely wonderful. I think it's the best Côte de Rhône I've ever drunk, but it's actually not a Côte de Rhône. It's a Les Baux, and the vineyard is actually in Saint-Remy, and it's and on its label is the Saint-Remy tree that Van Gogh painted from his hospital room, the cypress, but it's only in black, so it's not artistic enough for me. But I just love the wine. I just ordered 6 more bottles of it. because I couldn't quit drinking it once we got it. It's really a rich, beautiful wine. I'm not sure that that's the same wine. Yeah.
Just to add one more thought in terms of where we're going or where we're seeing wine go, the fact that there's so much going on right now about biodynamic and organic is in so many ways a greater stretch for even more life, even more renewal by getting closer to the earth. And I'm really curious in terms of how art is being depicted in that, and even how the definition of the perfect bottle. Some of us would say, some of what's going on in the truly close to the earth, we will not disturb anything, is not a perfect bottle, and others do.
Yeah.
And where that fits in all this.
I've been acquainted with biodynamic and wine for a long time because I was diagnosed with an allergy to sulfites in 1990, and I was in despair. I thought I had to quit drinking wine. And it turned out that was just the moment when all the wine started to happen. And I was ecstatic because I did a lot of research and found out that an average bottle of red wine has about 100 to 120 parts per thousand of sulfites. But a biodynamic wine or at any rate, they have about 10 parts per thousand. So it's much more drinkable. And then I also learned that the older the wine, between 6 and 8 years, the sulfites dissipate. So as a result, in 1990, I had to start drinking organic wines, and I had to start drinking older wines. And it was a real sacrifice to drink those older wines. Go ahead.
I just want to say what an incredibly marvelous presentation I thought that was, and I think a lot about overlapping topics and have written about them, and I just found this to be breathtakingly exciting to see. John?
Well, I'd agree with Rick, and I've seen quite a number of the paintings that you selected, and this is really an education. I've seen them. I had no clue as to the history behind it that you revealed this morning. But one of them was kind of interesting. It's been quite a few years, but the two Caravaggios in Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome, when I saw it, it was very dark in there. And there was a machine. If you put some coins in the machine, then the lights came on, and you could, and then you could see it just fine. And I'm wondering if that's still the case.
It's the last I knew, it was still the case. I mean, the Italians, the church never misses a chance to get a donation. Yeah, right. But the fun thing about, I put that Caravaggio St. Mark in my book, and told people the way to look at it was to turn the page 45 degrees so that you were looking at the painting the way you would look at it. And what's interesting when you do that, I couldn't do it in a slide, but the butt of the horse is even bigger. So it's quite a painting, actually.
I think you should turn this into a book.
That sort of occurred to me sometime along the way.
It's certainly a great start.
Thank you.
And I also want to observe that it is a large and hairy topic, and your decision to start with the Last Supper is brilliant because it not only brings together the wine and the question of the wine, the spirituality, the host, that evening, which is so incredibly special for multiple religions, and an opportunity to sort of ground your talk in a 2,000-year-old ritual. It may or may not have happened, but certainly we all believe it.
You know, what it blew me away, to tell you the truth, is the end of the Mark, verse 29, when he says, I will not drink the fruit of the vine again. I had passed over that my entire life and didn't remember it, didn't even know it. Suddenly read it and thought, why isn't he going to drink wine again? Because it's problematic. It's something he shouldn't do between now and the few days he had left. And that made the connection to the Greek, the connection between Christianity and Greek myth apparent to me for the first time.
Right.
Yeah.
I think we're ready for a 15-minute break. Another round of applause for what you put there.
Thank you.